Mark, we had a guilty verdict Thursday in a trial that I guess I've covered a number of cases over the years, and I was a little surprised at the length of a trial like this where you just had one charge, and it was a felony, but still I've seen some cases, you would think a case like this would wrap up in a day or two, but not so in this case. But if you really go back to the beginning of this case, it goes back, to, if I'm not mistaken, to the summer of 2016 when you filed charges.
Right.
And I know at the time you sent out a press release, and some of us in the media, we looked at the charges and were like, murder, manslaughter, and ultimately those two charges were dismissed by the judge, but you proceeded with the case.
Yep. The
defendant decided he was going to fight it and so on. But I mean, just from my perspective, this looks like you were pretty serious about this case. Can you tell us why you had some real strong feelings about this?
This was probably the pinnacle of why domestic abuse is such an issue and why it's so important to us. This was a case of a victim who endured a lifetime of domestic abuse from her husband, and ultimately, in order to escape, she committed suicide. And so, as we looked at the case, we had an open file on him at that, before she died. But as we looked at the case, I felt then, and I still feel, that it was really a murder case. That he abused her to the point where she took her life, and he should be held responsible for that. We were not able to proceed with the murder charges or the manslaughter charges, largely because our victim was dead. And to be able to get in the evidence we needed to prove up the murder charges, we would need to get in her statements, more of her statements than we could. And I have confidence in and don't have any problem with the judge's ruling. The judge ultimately threw out those charges, but we did not stop. We also had a pattern of stalking conduct charge going, and we continued forward, and that was the trial that we did the last week and a half, and we got a guilty verdict yesterday. It was proving up all the history of violence that they endured, proving up the victims trying to get away, and as the prosecutor in the case, Byron Black, said to the jury, ultimately she did get away, but she committed suicide to do that. It was a very important case for us, and we're very satisfied with the verdict.
Did you, I'm trying to think, so she committed suicide in December of 2015. These charges, the case was filed 6-7 months later. Did you know at the time of her death that she'd been through this abuse? Or, I mean, what led you to file this case?
The most recent incidents had been in May of 2015. There was an incident in Mower County in May of 2015, and an incident here in Olmsted County in about 2 weeks later in 2015, May of 2015. And so we'd had some recent cases, and in fact, there was an open domestic violence no contact order from our case still pending, and there was like well over 1,000 violations by the defendant of that no contact order. I mean, it was just persistent.
One order,
but there was like 1,000. We had her phone records, and that was just the phone contacts, the phone violations. So we were pretty aware of the persistent violations, the persistent abuse that was continuing ongoing, and it was such a tragedy when she took her life. It took us a while to go forward on the new charges because I wanted to move forward on the murder charges, and that's a big deal. Nobody else has ever done that. And so we wanted to make sure that we had the probable cause, that we had the basis to go forward, and I believe we did, and I still believe we did. And it just came down to a ruling of what evidence could come in and what evidence the judge just simply wasn't going to let weigh.
And the gist of this again was that one of the incidents of abuse led to, if I'm not mistaken, a traumatic brain injury, and you feel very strongly that ultimately led her to commit suicide.
We do, and actually in this trial, because we were asking for an aggravated sentence. In this trial, we had to ask the jury to answer specific questions. So it wasn't just, is he guilty or not? One of the questions was she particularly vulnerable? And I believe we also asked them if they thought that he had caused the traumatic brain injury in a previous assault. And they answered affirmative to all those questions. And so because they made that finding, it was a series of findings, we're now going to ask for an aggravated sentence and try and get the maximum sentence we can. But we felt at the time that he caused that traumatic brain injury, and again, that's one of the elements that we wanted to put forward as to why this was murder, because he caused the injury that made her even more vulnerable, and in fact made her more vulnerable to take her own life.
So it's going to be almost comparable to someone who's charged with murder if they sell drugs to someone who overdoses and dies.
That was pretty much the same type of theory that we were operating on here, that the defendant caused the situation that made her take her life. And I still feel very strongly he did. We just didn't have the evidence that we could put forward to get to a jury on that question. I can't say I disagree with the judge's order on that. I wish we could have gotten to a jury, because I'd love to have heard what the jury would have decided.
With the murder charge or manslaughter charge.
But they had no problem with the pattern of stalking conduct. You know, we had about a 7-day trial, and the jury was able to reach a verdict in about 90 minutes. So,
I don't know if this is the history on this case, or this couple, but in a lot of domestic abuse cases, you see where the victim, usually the woman, is abused continuously and yet goes back to her boyfriend or husband, and then maybe start all over again. Was that the case here too?
Absolutely.
And if so, can you explain that?
Absolutely, and that is so common. And we actually, as part of our evidence, one of our witnesses, we were bringing in an expert witness to testify about that.
On why that happens.
Why that happens.
Yeah.
That is actually a typical response to domestic violence. And, then the snowstorm hit, and the expert witness that we were bringing in was from Duluth, and she couldn't get here. But we brought in a different expert witness, and actually brought somebody from the Rochester Police Department.
So what do they tell the jury?
They just talked about the dynamics of domestic violence and the cycle of abuse. And
did they get into why the victim keeps going back?
They don't necessarily get into why, but they explain to the jury that it's not uncommon, that it happens all the time. You just understand that they're involved in a very significant relationship, and
in this case, they were together, what, 11 years? 10, 11 years,
yeah. And they had kids together, and so there's a lot of reasons why they need to stay together. And so, but there's just a host of reasons of why people come back, and what the expert is able to share with the jury is the fact that the victim keeps going back doesn't mean the abuse didn't happen. And
then you get some cases where the victim will say, "I don't want to press charges," or I don't want this case to go ahead.
That's exactly what happened in this case. For 10 years, she was saying that. For 10 years, she would report, call 911, and then the cops get there, and she would say, "Well, I don't want to press charges." And they always respected that. In fact, the case in Mower County, it occurred in May of 2015. She did it then. And Mower County dismissed the case because she didn't want to go forward.
Now, we've had a change in state law, because I know there's a case just recently here in town where you had a domestic abuse situation, and the victim said, "I don't want to press charges," but the police said, "We don't care. We're still going to proceed, with or without your testimony."
And that usually comes out of our office, because we take the position that, if we can get the victim's testimony in there, one way or another, that we're going to go forward. Now, if it's purely, the 911 call comes in, and the only evidence we've got is the victim's statement, and the victim doesn't want to go forward, then we can't. But if we've got any other way to get that evidence in there, we're going to go forward on these cases. Because I don't ever want to have another case like this, where the victim just simply can't go on and takes her own life. I mean, that's the ultimate tragedy.
For someone who may be watching this interview, Mark, they know someone, or maybe they are in a situation like that, what can you tell them? Where do they go for help?
Well, there's so many places to get services, and it just shouldn't happen. And really, the focus of our prosecution in these cases is not to throw the defendant in jail. It's not to break up this relationship. It's to keep the victim safe. That's what it's all about. And all we want to do is create an environment where we can get the education and the counseling to the defendant so they stop abusing their victims. We're not trying to break up relationships. We're trying to preserve them and make them safe. But that's the fear that victims have, is that if they go forward on the prosecution, that it's going to end their marriage, their relationship, whatever. That's not our goal. Our goal is to make them safe. So, you need to call. There's a ton of services out there. We'll do the best we can to keep them safe. But it's not about separating them. It's about keeping them safe.
Okay. Mark, thank you.
My pleasure.